At 10:03 p.m. on March 22, 1980, 20-year-old Eve Wilkowitz stepped off the train at Bayshore Station, her heels tapping familiar sidewalks on the 8-block walk home. It was a route she'd taken hundreds of times, through a quiet town where doors stayed unlocked and children rode bikes past dark. But by morning, Eve's bed was untouched, her coffee mug still in the sink, and her sister Irene Wilkowitz's calls echoed through empty rooms. Police suggested she'd stayed overnight in the city, but Irene knew better. Eve always came home. 3 days later, a neighbor found her body hidden under leaves in a nearby yard. She'd been strangled, violated, and discarded. Her belongings gone. For 42 years, her killer walked among those who mourned her, attending the same churches and shops. Then science finally caught up with his sins and revealed the monster who had once passed as just another neighbor. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Eve Wilkowitz smoothed her skirt as the Long Island Railroad train swayed gently toward Bayshore. The car was nearly empty at this hour, just a few other commuters heading home after long work days in Manhattan. She turned another page of her romance novel, losing herself in a story about second chances and happy endings. At 20, Eve believed in happy endings. She had plans, maybe marriage someday, children, a house with a garden where she could grow tomatoes like her mother used to. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. Next stop, Bayshore. Bayshore. Next stop. Eve bookmarked her page and gathered her things. Her purse, a brown leather bag her sister had given her for Christmas, contained the usual items: wallet, keys, lipstick, a roll of lifesavers, and $23 from her weekly paycheck. She'd worked late that Friday, helping Mr. Peterson prepare contracts for Monday's meetings. The extra overtime would help with rent. The train lurched to a stop. Eve stepped onto the platform, breathing in the cool March air. A few other passengers scattered toward waiting cars or began their own walks home. The station clock read 10:03 p.m., perfect timing. She'd be home by 10:15, just in time to catch the late movie with Irene. The walk from Bayshore Station to apartment 4B on Birchell Avenue usually took 12 minutes. Eve knew every crack in the sidewalk, every house along the way. Mrs. Chin's garden where daffodils were just beginning to push through winter soil. The Murphy house where old setter Sam barked at every passerby. The corner where teenagers gathered on summer evenings, their laughter echoing between the modest colonial homes. Tonight, the streets were quiet. Most families were inside, settling in for the weekend. Yellow squares of light glowed from living room windows, where televisions played and children did homework at kitchen tables. Eve passed beneath the street lamps, her shadow stretching and shrinking with each pool of light. She thought about tomorrow's plans. Irene wanted to go shopping at the mall, maybe catch a matinee movie. They might visit their parents in Islip, help with the spring cleaning their mother had been postponing since February. Simple pleasures for two sisters sharing life's small adventures. At the intersection of 3rd Avenue and Birch Hill, Eve paused to adjust her purse strap. A car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating her face before disappearing around the corner. She looked both ways, an old habit from childhood, and crossed the street. The next streetlight stood 50 yards ahead, casting its amber glow across the sidewalk where she would never arrive. Irene jolted awake at 6:30 a.m., evening sunlight streaming through their shared bedroom window. Eve's bed was still made, pajamas folded neatly on the pillow where she'd left them Friday morning. The bathroom showed no signs of use. Toothbrush dry, towel hanging unused on its hook. Irene contacted the few friends Eve might visit, though Eve rarely made impulsive plans. Each phone call yielded the same answer: "No, we haven't seen her. Have you called the police?" At 2:17 p.m., Irene walked into the Suffolk County Police Station in Bayshore. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, listened with professional patience as she explained her sister's disappearance. 20 years old, you said. He pulled out a form. Sometimes young people need space. Maybe she met someone, decided to spend the weekend. You don't understand, Irene interrupted. Eve doesn't disappear, she calls. She always calls. The sergeant began filling out Form 27, a missing person report. Under circumstances of disappearance, he wrote, failed to return home from work. Last seen boarding LIR train at Penn Station, 9:47 p.m., March 22, 1980. Detective Frank Morrison knocked on the door of 247 Birchell Avenue at 8:00, i.e. Monday morning. Mrs. Helen Murphy, a widow in her 70s, answered in her bathrobe, clutching a cup of coffee. Suffolk County Police, ma'am. We're asking residents about a young woman who went missing Friday night. Eve Wilkowitz? Do you recognize the name? Mrs. Murphy's face softened with concern. Oh, the Wilkowitz girl. I know her. She walks past here every night from the train. Sweet thing, always waves if she sees me at the window. Did you see her Friday night? Let me think. Mrs. Murphy frowned, concentrating. Friday was when I watched that detective show. What's it called? Columbo. That ends at 10. I remember because I got up to turn off the porch light, and I think I saw someone walking past. Could have been her, Morrison made notes. Every detail mattered in missing person cases, especially after a weekend had passed. Time was becoming the enemy. The door-to-door canvass continued throughout Monday. Mr. Chen at 239 Burchell had been asleep by 9:30. The Kowalski family at 251 reported nothing unusual. Tommy Richards, 16, admitted he'd been smoking cigarettes behind the garage around 10 p.m., but hadn't noticed any pedestrians. By Tuesday afternoon, Morrison had interviewed 37 neighbors. The picture remained frustratingly incomplete. Eve had walked into the neighborhood Friday night, but no one could definitively say they'd seen her reach her apartment building. The last confirmed sighting placed her at the intersection of 3rd and Burchell, 50 yards from home. Wednesday morning, March 25th, brought the kind of spring weather that makes people notice their surroundings differently. Warmer air, clearer light, the promise of renewal after winter's grit. Walter Hendricks, a retired mailman, decided his Cocker Spaniel, Rusty, needed extra exercise after being cooped up during the weekend's rain. They walked their usual route through the neighborhood behind Burchell Avenue, where newer construction had left patches of undeveloped land between houses. Rusty loved investigating the tall grass and scattered trees where suburban development met nature's stubborn persistence. At 7:43 a.m., Rusty began barking frantically near a clump of forsythia bushes behind 189 Oak Street. Not his usual territorial bark, but something urgent, distressed. Walter called the dog, but Rusty wouldn't come. He kept pawing at something, whimpering. Walter pushed through the brush and saw what had upset his dog. Eve lay partially concealed beneath a scatter of dead leaves and debris. Her navy coat was torn and dirty, her face turned away from the morning sun. Walter's 26 years of mail delivery had taught him to notice details, but his mind refused to process what he was seeing. He stumbled backward, his hand shaking as he reached for the emergency whistle he'd carried since his postal service days. The sharp blast pierced the quiet morning air again and again until Mrs. Patterson from Oak Street came running to see what was wrong. "Call the police," Walter gasped. "Call them right now." By 8:15 a.m., yellow tape cordoned off the area. Detective Morrison arrived to find what every police officer dreads but expects in missing person cases. Confirmation that hope had been an illusion. Dr. Patricia Reeves had performed over 800 autopsies in her 15-year career as Suffolk County's deputy medical examiner. She approached each case with professional detachment, understanding that families needed facts, not emotion. But examining Eve Wilkowitz required every ounce of her clinical training. The evidence told a brutal story. Eve had been sexually assaulted and strangled, her body showing signs of a violent struggle. Bruises on her hands and arms indicated she'd fought desperately against her attacker. Tissue samples collected from beneath her fingernails might contain DNA from her killer, though forensic science in 1980 lacked the technology to analyze such evidence effectively. Dr. Reeves cataloged each finding with meticulous care. The killer had attempted to conceal the body, suggesting he knew the area well enough to find a secluded spot quickly. Eve's purse and jewelry were missing, though the sexual nature of the assault indicated robbery had not been the primary motive. Most significantly, the medical examiner recovered microscopic fibers and biological material that would be preserved in evidence storage. In 1980, these samples represented hope for future breakthroughs in forensic technology. Detective Morrison received Reeves' preliminary report at 6:30 p.m. Thursday evening. The official cause of death, asphyxia due to manual strangulation, associated with sexual assault. The manner of death, homicide. That night, Morrison called the Wilkowitz family to deliver news that would reshape their lives forever. Eve hadn't simply disappeared. She had been murdered by someone who might still be walking free in their community. The investigation was no longer about finding a missing person. It was about catching a killer. By Friday morning, the Bayshore community was grappling with a new reality. A killer had walked among them. Detective Morrison organized a systematic investigation, starting with every man who lived or worked within a mile radius of the crime scene. The Suffolk County police artist Maria Santos worked with the few witnesses who had reported seeing anyone near the area that Friday night. Mrs. Patterson from Oak Street remembered a man walking past her house around 10:30 p.m., tall, medium build, wearing dark clothing. Mr. Kowalski had noticed someone near the bus stop on 3rd Avenue but couldn't provide detailed features. The composite sketch showed a white male, approximately 25-35 years old, with angular features and dark hair. Generic enough to describe thousands of Long Island residents, but specific enough to generate tips from concerned citizens. Morrison's team distributed 500 copies throughout Nassau and Suffolk counties. The sketch appeared in Newsday and local weekly papers. Bayshore's post office displayed it prominently, and merchants taped copies to store windows. Tips began flowing immediately. Suspicious ex-boyfriends, odd neighbors, transients who'd been seen in the area. Each lead required investigation, interviews, alibis checked and rechecked. Morrison worked 18-hour days, driven by the knowledge that stranger killings were notoriously difficult to solve, and time was working against them. 3 men were brought in for questioning during the first week. One had been drinking at Murphy's Tavern until midnight and had witnesses. Another was visiting family in Albany. The third became defensive and hostile, but eventually provided alibi documentation proving he'd been working a late shift at Grumman Aerospace. Each cleared suspect represented another dead end in an increasingly frustrating investigation. Summer arrived in Bayshore with the heaviness that follows trauma. The community had settled into a new rhythm of caution and suspicion. Parents drove children to activities they'd previously walked to alone. Women organized carpools from the train station. Hardware stores reported increased sales of deadbolts and security systems. Detective Morrison's case files had grown to 3 thick folders. Over 200 interviews conducted, dozens of tips investigated, evidence carefully cataloged and stored. The DNA samples, hair fibers, and tissue fragments sat in the Suffolk County Police Evidence Room, waiting for scientific advances that might be years away. The investigation had revealed uncomfortable truths about seemingly ordinary men. Mr. Henderson from Maple Street had a conviction for voyeurism from 1975. Bobby Castellanos, who worked at the gas station, had been accused of attempted rape in 1978, though charges were dropped. Frank Morrison realized how little neighbors really knew about each other, how easily dangerous men could hide behind facades of normalcy. By Labor Day, the leads had dried up. The composite sketch had generated over 150 tips, but none yielded viable suspects. The case remained active, but Morrison knew from experience that without new evidence or witnesses, investigations like this could stagnate for years. At the 6-month mark, Morrison wrote in his report, "All available leads have been pursued. Physical evidence has been preserved for future forensic analysis. The case remains open pending new information or technological advances in DNA analysis." Eve's family held their first memorial service that September, marking what they hoped would be temporary closure while justice remained elusive. The 1980s passed like seasons of grief for the Wilkowitz family. Each spring brought renewed hope when new detectives reviewed Eve's case. Each winter brought the familiar disappointment of another year without answers. Irene had moved back in with their parents, unable to return to the apartment she'd shared with Eve. She threw herself into college, then a teaching career, but Eve's absence colored every milestone. Graduations, promotions, relationships, all felt incomplete without her sister to share them. Detective Morrison retired in 1985, handing Eve's files to Detective Sarah Chen. No relation to the Burchell Avenue Chens. Chen was young, ambitious, and convinced fresh eyes might spot details her predecessor had missed. She re-interviewed key witnesses, had the composite sketch updated with modern techniques, and submitted the DNA evidence to 3 different laboratories, hoping for new analysis methods. The answer was always the same. The technology didn't exist yet to process samples that old and degraded. By 1987, Suffolk County had experienced 16 more murders. Each demanded immediate attention, resources, and detective hours. Cold cases like Eve's were reviewed annually but rarely received active investigation unless new evidence emerged. Irene started writing letters to the police department, the district attorney, local newspapers, anyone who might keep Eve's story alive. She understood that forgotten victims stay forgotten forever, and she refused to let Eve disappear a second time. On March 22, 1980, exactly 8 years after Eve's murder, Irene held the first candlelight vigil in Bayshore's Memorial Park. 43 people attended, many who had never known Eve personally but understood that unsolved crimes threatened everyone's safety. The 1990s brought revolutionary advances in forensic science, but Eve's case remained trapped in technological limitation. DNA fingerprinting had solved high-profile cases in England and was being adopted by American law enforcement, but the samples from Eve's murder were too degraded for existing analysis methods. Detective Chen tried everything. She contacted the FBI's new forensic laboratory in Quantico, sent samples to private companies developing DNA techniques, even reached out to universities conducting research in genetic analysis. The response was always polite but frustrating. The samples were too old, too contaminated, too limited for current technology. Meanwhile, on November 3, 1991, Herbert Rice died of lung cancer at Bayshore Community Hospital. He was 42 years old, survived by his ex-wife and a son who lived in Florida. Rice had worked various jobs throughout the 1980s: construction, landscaping, part-time maintenance work. His obituary in the local paper was brief. Herbert J. Rice, 42, died after a battle with cancer. Services will be private. No one connected Herbert Rice to Eve Wilkowitz. He had never been interviewed during the original investigation, had no criminal record that would have brought him to police attention, and lived quietly enough to avoid community gossip. Rice was buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery in Bayshore Section D, Plot 127. His grave marker was simple granite with just his name and dates: Herbert J. Rice, 1949-1991. His secrets went with him into the ground. Detective Chen attended the funeral of another homicide victim that same week, a teenager killed in a drive-by shooting. Active cases demanded attention. Cold cases waited patiently in their metal storage boxes. The new millennium brought extraordinary developments in forensic DNA analysis. Cases that had been cold for decades were suddenly solvable. The combined DNA index system CODIS database was expanding rapidly, and improved extraction techniques could analyze smaller, older samples than ever before. Irene read every article about DNA breakthroughs: the 2001 conviction of a rapist in California using 20-year-old evidence, the 2004 identification of a serial killer through familial DNA searching, the 2008 arrest of the BTK killer in Kansas after 31 years. Each success story gave her hope and frustration in equal measure. If science could solve these cases, why not Eve's? Detective Chen had been promoted to sergeant and eventually transferred to the Major Crimes Unit. Eve's case passed to Detective Luis Rodriguez in 2005. Rodriguez was methodical and persistent, reviewing the files annually and maintaining contact with the Wilkowitz family. In 2010, Rodriguez sent Eve's evidence to a private laboratory specializing in degraded DNA analysis. The results were promising but incomplete: a partial genetic profile that might be useful for comparison, but couldn't be searched in existing databases. Irene, now 45 and a veteran elementary school teacher, had never married. Friends and family worried she was defining her entire life around her sister's murder, but Irene felt she had no choice. Someone had to keep Eve's memory alive. Someone had to demand justice. "I've lived these years always looking over my shoulder," she told a reporter in 2012. "Wondering if the man who killed my sister was still out there, still dangerous." This isn't just about Eve anymore. It's about every woman who should be able to walk home safely. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: amateur genealogists and their online family trees. By 2018, millions of Americans had submitted DNA samples to ancestry websites, creating an enormous database of genetic relationships that forensic investigators were beginning to explore. The Golden State Killer case in California demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy. Investigators had used DNA from crime scenes to identify distant relatives in public databases, then worked backward through family trees to identify suspects. Detective Rodriguez, now a lieutenant, attended a seminar on genetic genealogy in 2019. The presenter explained how even partial DNA profiles could be compared against millions of genetic records to find familial connections. Rodriguez returned to Suffolk County with new hope for old cases. He selected 5 unsolved murders with preserved DNA evidence, including Eve's, for the genetic genealogy pilot program. In September 2020, Rodriguez submitted Eve's DNA profile to Family Tree DNA's law enforcement database. Within hours, the system identified several potential familial matches, people who shared enough genetic markers with Eve's killer to be distant relatives. The matches were third and fourth cousins, too distant for immediate identification, but they provided crucial starting points for genealogical research. Working with professional genealogist Amanda Foster, Rodriguez began mapping family trees, looking for male relatives who would have been the right age and location in 1980. One family name kept appearing in the research: Rice. Several of the DNA matches connected to a Rice family line that had lived on Long Island for generations. By December 2020, the investigation had narrowed to 3 possible suspects within the Rice family tree. 2 were eliminated quickly. One had died in 1975. Another had been serving in the military overseas in 1980. The third candidate was Herbert Rice. Lieutenant Rodriguez knew he needed absolute proof before approaching the Rice family or making any public announcements. Herbert Rice had been dead for nearly 30 years, but his son Michael was still alive and living in Clearwater, Florida. The approach required delicate handling. Michael Rice had no knowledge of the investigation and no reason to suspect his father of anything worse than the alcoholism and emotional distance that had marked his childhood. On January 15, 2021, Detective Maria Santos, the same police artist who had drawn the composite sketch in 1980, now serving as a detective, flew to Florida. She met Michael Rice at his insurance office, explaining that Suffolk County was reviewing several old cases and hoping to eliminate his father as a potential person of interest. "This is probably a waste of everyone's time," Santos explained carefully, "but we need to rule out certain individuals who lived in the Bayshore area during the 1980s. Would you be willing to provide a voluntary DNA sample just so we can close the loop on our investigation?" Michael Rice agreed immediately. He had warm memories of his father, who had died when Michael was only 22, but he understood the importance of police work. The cheek swab took 30 seconds. 3 weeks later, the laboratory results arrived. The DNA from Michael Rice showed the expected familial relationship to the evidence from Eve's murder. Herbert Rice's son carried genetic markers that could only have come from Eve's killer. Rodriguez stared at the report, processing 41 years of investigation condensed into columns of numbers and letters. They had found Eve's murderer. Now they needed to prove it beyond any doubt. Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney reviewed the genetic genealogy evidence with his most experienced prosecutors. The familial DNA match was compelling, but not sufficient for a public announcement. They needed direct DNA comparison from Herbert Rice himself. That meant exhumation. The legal process required careful documentation. Rice's family had to be notified and given opportunity to object. The court needed compelling evidence that the exhumation served justice rather than mere curiosity. Environmental and health officials required assurance that the process would be conducted safely and respectfully. Michael Rice was devastated when contacted about the exhumation request. His father had been a quiet man, sometimes drinking too much after losing construction jobs, but Michael couldn't reconcile his memories with the possibility of murder. "My dad had problems," he told Detective Santos during a second interview. "He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a killer. There has to be some mistake." On March 8, 2021, Suffolk County Court Judge Patricia Williams signed the exhumation order. The court found that credible evidence exists suggesting Herbert J. Rice may have committed homicide and that DNA analysis of his remains may provide definitive identification of the perpetrator of said crime. The exhumation was scheduled for March 20, 2021, 2 days before the 41st anniversary of Eve's murder. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved in the investigation. Irene was notified that significant developments were occurring in her sister's case, but was asked to remain patient while the legal process continued. After 4 decades of waiting, a few more weeks seemed both insignificant and eternal. The exhumation took place at 6:00 a.m. on a gray March morning. The cemetery crew worked efficiently and respectfully, supervised by Suffolk County investigators and a forensic anthropologist from the medical examiner's office. Herbert Rice had been buried in a simple pine casket that had deteriorated significantly after 30 years in Long Island soil. However, skeletal remains and dental material provided excellent sources for DNA extraction. Bone and tooth samples were transported to the same private laboratory that had analyzed the original evidence and Michael Rice's DNA sample. The comparison would be definitive. Either Herbert Rice was Eve's killer, or the genetic genealogy had led them astray. On April 2, 2021, Lieutenant Rodriguez received the call he'd been anticipating for 6 weeks. The laboratory director's voice was calm but certain. "It's a match. The DNA from Herbert Rice's remains is consistent with the evidence from your 1980 homicide. The probability of this occurring by coincidence is less than 1 in 100 billion. Rodriguez sat quietly for several minutes after hanging up the phone. 41 years of investigation had finally reached its conclusion. Eve Wilkowitz's killer had been identified with absolute scientific certainty. The investigation that had begun with a young woman's disappearance from a train platform was about to end with the revelation that her murderer had lived in the same community, walked the same streets, shopped in the same stores as the people who mourned her dead. Herbert Rice had died of cancer in 1991, never knowing that advances in forensic science would eventually expose his crime. He had carried his secret to the grave, but science had dug it back up. District Attorney Ray Tierney stood before the assembled media on April 15, 2021, flanked by Lieutenant Rodriguez and other investigators who had worked Eve's case across 4 decades. The press room at Suffolk County Police Headquarters was packed beyond capacity, with additional reporters joining via video conference. Behind Tierney, a large display board showed photographs from the investigation, Eve's smiling high school portrait, the crime scene from 1980, the evidence bags that had waited 41 years for technology to unlock their secrets. And finally, a driver's license photo of Herbert Rice taken shortly before his death. After 42 years of investigation, tyranny began. I am here to announce that the Suffolk County Police Department has identified the person responsible for the rape and murder of Eve Wilkowitz on March 22, 1980. Irene sat in the front row, clutching a tissue and the same photograph of Eve she'd carried to every press conference and vigil for 4 decades. She had waited for this moment longer than her sister had been alive. Through advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, we have determined with scientific certainty that Herbert J. Rice of Bayshore committed this heinous crime. Mr. Rice died of natural causes in 1991, which means he cannot be prosecuted for his crime. However, his identification provides long-awaited answers to Eve's family and our community. Tierney explained the investigation's progression from the original 1980 evidence collection through the genetic genealogy breakthrough and final DNA confirmation. The scientific certainty was overwhelming. Herbert Rice was Eve's killer. The room fell silent as the weight of the announcement settled over everyone present. After 4 decades, Eve finally had a name. When invited to speak, Irene approached the microphone with shaking hands. Her voice was stronger than anyone expected, strengthened by decades of advocacy and the relief of finally knowing the truth. My name is Irene Wilkowitz, and Eve was my older sister. She was 20 years old when Herbert Rice murdered her. I was 17, just finishing high school, and I thought we'd have our whole lives together as sisters, as friends, as each other's bridesmaids and children's aunts. She paused, looking directly into the television cameras that would carry her words across Long Island and beyond. For 42 years, I've wondered who killed my sister. I've wondered if he was still alive, still dangerous, still walking free while Eve lay in her grave. I've lived these years afraid, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if the man who destroyed our family might be watching from the crowd at her memorial services. Irene's voice grew stronger as she continued. This was all I wanted, not revenge. You can't prosecute a dead man, not closure. Nothing will bring Eve back or give us the life we should have had together. I just wanted to know. I wanted Eve's killer to be named, for the truth to be spoken, for our community to understand that the evil we feared had been hiding among us all along. She held up the photograph of Eve that had become iconic in Bayshore. Eve was kind, responsible, and trusting. She believed in people's goodness. Herbert Rice took advantage of that trust and destroyed not just Eve's life, but the lives of everyone who loved her. Today, finally, we can say his name and know that the truth has survived longer than his secrets. The revelation that Herbert Rice was Eve's killer sent shockwaves through Bayshore's longtime residents. Many remembered Rice as a quiet, unremarkable man who had lived in the community for years after Eve's murder without ever attracting suspicion. Mary Patterson, now 89 and still living on Oak Street near where Eve's body was found, told Newsday, I remember Herbert. He did odd jobs around the neighborhood, lawn work, small repairs. He was at my house once fixing a gutter, maybe 6 months after that poor girl was killed. To think he was the one who murdered her, and he was right there in my backyard. Former Bayshore High School classmates of Rice described him as withdrawn and unremarkable. He was just there, recalled Janet Morrison, who had graduated with Rice in 1967. Not popular, not unpopular. The kind of person you wouldn't notice unless you specifically looked for him. The psychological impact on the community was profound. For 42 years, Bayshore residents had lived with the fear that a killer might be among them. The revelation that their fears had been justified, that Rice had indeed walked their streets, attended community events, and lived as their neighbor while carrying the secret of murder, was deeply unsettling. It's almost worse knowing, admitted Robert Chin, whose family had lived on Eve's walking route in 1980. For years we wondered if it was a stranger, someone passing through. But it was someone who belonged here, someone who could have been anyone. How do you ever feel completely safe again? The case became a stark reminder that evil often wears ordinary faces and lives ordinary lives while harboring extraordinary secrets. The scientific breakthrough that solved Eve's case represented the convergence of multiple technological advances that hadn't existed in 1980. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic geneticist who conducted the final DNA analysis, explained the process that had made justice possible. When Eve was murdered in 1980, DNA fingerprinting didn't exist, Dr. Walsh told the assembled media. The biological evidence was preserved properly by the original investigators, but we simply didn't have the technology to analyze it meaningfully. The key breakthrough had been the development of techniques for analyzing degraded DNA samples, combined with massive public databases of genetic information from genealogy websites. Where traditional DNA databases contained only convicted criminals, genetic genealogy databases included millions of ordinary citizens interested in their family histories. We were able to extract a partial DNA profile from evidence that would have been useless just 10 years ago, Dr. Walsh continued. Then we compared that profile against millions of genetic records to identify distant relatives of the killer. The process had required months of genealogical research to map family trees and identify potential suspects. The Rice family connection had emerged through careful analysis of third and fourth cousin matches, people who shared great-great-grandparents with Herbert Rice. Lieutenant Rodriguez credited the advancement to persistent evidence preservation and the Wilkowitz family's refusal to let the case be forgotten. Without Irene's constant advocacy, without her annual letters and media interviews, Eve's case might have been archived and forgotten, Rodriguez explained. Cold case investigations require resources, and departments naturally focus on cases where families remain engaged and hopeful. The technical aspects of the identification were remarkable. Scientists had extracted usable DNA from biological material that was over 40 years old, then used sophisticated algorithms to identify familial relationships across multiple generations of genetic data. This case demonstrates that no murder is truly unsolvable, Dr. Walsh concluded. Time and technology are on the side of justice. Evidence that seems useless today might be the key to solving cases tomorrow. 6 months after Herbert Rice was identified as Eve's killer, the Bayshore community held a memorial service at St. Patrick's Church. Ironically, this same church where Rice had occasionally attended services during the 1980s. The service was designed to honor Eve's memory while providing closure for a community that had lived with uncertainty for over 4 decades. Reverend Michael O'Brien, who had served St. Patrick's since 1975 and had conducted Eve's original funeral mass, led the memorial service. Over 200 people attended, including many who had never known Eve personally but understood the importance of marking this moment in their community's history. Irene spoke again, her words different from the press conference months earlier. Here, surrounded by neighbors and friends, she focused less on justice and more on memory. Eve loved this community, she said from the pulpit where her sister's funeral eulogy had been delivered 42 years earlier. She felt safe walking these streets at night because she trusted the people around her. Herbert Rice violated that trust in the worst possible way, but he didn't destroy the goodness that Eve believed in. The service included readings from community members who had participated in search efforts, attended vigils, and kept Eve's memory alive through 4 decades of uncertainty. Each person who spoke emphasized how the case had affected not just the Wilkowitz family, but the entire Bayshore community's sense of security and trust. During the final prayer, Reverend O'Brien offered gratitude for scientific advances that had finally provided answers, while acknowledging that some wounds can heal but never disappear entirely. The empty lot behind Oak Street where Eve's body had been discovered in 1980 looked dramatically different in 2021. What had once been undeveloped land, scattered with forsythia bushes and tall grass, was now a small neighborhood park with playground equipment and walking paths. The Bayshore Town Council had dedicated the park as Eve's Garden in 1995, 15 years after her murder. Irene had attended the dedication ceremony, planting the first rose bush in what would become a memorial garden maintained by community volunteers. Standing in the park during the weeks following Rice's identification, visitors could barely imagine the horror that had occurred there 4 decades earlier. Children played on swings where crime scene tape had once fluttered. Families walked dogs along paths that investigators had methodically searched for evidence. Lieutenant Rodriguez visited the park frequently during the final months of the investigation. The transformation from crime scene to memorial space seemed to symbolize the community's ability to create beauty from tragedy, hope from horror. This is what justice looks like, he reflected while watching children play near the Memorial Rose Garden. Not just punishment for criminals, but communities healing and moving forward while remembering their losses. A small granite marker near the garden's entrance bore a simple inscription, "In memory of Eve Wilkowitz, 1959 to 1980, beloved daughter, sister, and friend. Her light continues to shine in our hearts." The marker made no mention of Herbert Rice. In death, as in life, he remained unremarkable and largely forgotten. Eve's memory, by contrast, had grown stronger with each passing year. The success of Eve's case contributed to a nationwide revolution in cold case investigation. By late 2021, genetic genealogy had solved over 300 murders and sexual assaults that had been cold for decades. The technique was becoming standard practice in police departments across America. Dr. Walsh received requests from law enforcement agencies nationwide, all hoping to apply similar techniques to their oldest unsolved cases. The limiting factors were no longer technological, but practical: the time required for genealogical research and the expense of advanced DNA analysis. Every police department in America has evidence boxes full of unsolved cases, Dr. Walsh explained to a conference of forensic scientists in December 2021. Cases like Eve Wilkowitz's, where good evidence was collected and preserved but couldn't be analyzed with period technology. The implications were staggering. Thousands of murders from the 1,970s, 80s, and 90s might be solvable using techniques that hadn't existed when the crimes were committed. Cold case investigators began ranking their oldest files based on evidence quality and community impact. Suffolk County established a dedicated cold case unit focused exclusively on genetic genealogy investigations. Lieutenant Rodriguez was promoted to captain and assigned to lead the unit, with Eve's case serving as the template for future investigations. Eve's case showed us that persistence pays off, Rodriguez told new detectives during training sessions. Evidence doesn't deteriorate if it's properly preserved, technology improves, databases grow, justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. By 2022, Suffolk County had reopened 12 additional cold cases using genetic genealogy techniques pioneered during Eve's investigation. On March 22, 2022, exactly 42 years after Eve's murder, Irene wrote her final letter to the Suffolk County Police Department. Unlike the dozens of previous letters requesting updates, demanding action, or expressing frustration, this letter carried a tone of gratitude and resolution. Dear Captain Rodriguez and the entire investigative team, she began. Today marks 42 years since my sister Eve was murdered by Herbert Rice. I never thought I would write a letter like this one. A letter of thanks rather than desperate pleading. Irene reflected on the decades of uncertainty that had shaped her adult life. The fear, the sleepless nights, the relationships that had suffered because she couldn't fully trust or commit, while her sister's killer remained unknown. I realize now that I spent 41 years of my life partially frozen in that moment when Eve disappeared, she wrote, not just grieving her death, but living with the terrible knowledge that someone had murdered her and was walking free. Every man I passed on the street could have been him. Every friendly neighbor could have been hiding monstrous secrets. The identification of Herbert Rice had changed everything, even though he was beyond earthly justice. Knowing his name, understanding that he's been dead for 30 years, has given me a kind of peace I didn't think was possible, Irene continued. I'm 59 years old now. I've spent more years missing Eve than I had with her, but I can finally stop looking over my shoulder. I can finally stop being afraid. She concluded, thank you for never giving up. Thank you for preserving the evidence that would eventually speak for Eve. Thank you for proving that truth is stronger than time. The metal storage box that had held Eve's case files for over 4 decades was finally marked with a red solved stamp on April 15, 2022. Inside were hundreds of documents, photographs, evidence bags, and reports that chronicled one of Suffolk County's longest-running investigations. The box contained Detective Morrison's original handwritten notes from 1980, faded but still legible. Crime scene photographs that had been studied by dozens of investigators across 4 decades. The composite sketch that had generated hundreds of tips but never led to the actual killer. DNA evidence vials that had waited years for technology to catch up with their secrets. Also preserved were Irene's letters, dozens of them, spanning from 1981 to 2021, documenting a sister's refusal to let her family's tragedy be forgotten. Her correspondence showed the evolution from desperate grief to determined advocacy to final gratitude. Captain Rodriguez supervised the final organization of Eve's files, ensuring that future researchers and law enforcement professionals could study the case as an example of how persistence, proper evidence preservation, and advancing technology could deliver justice decades after crimes were committed. This case file represents more than just one solved murder, Rodriguez explained to his staff. It's a testament to the importance of never giving up, of preserving evidence properly, and of listening to families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. The box was placed in Suffolk County's permanent archives, where it would be available for law enforcement training and academic research. Eve's story had become part of the historical record, her case a landmark in the evolution of forensic science. In the fall of 2022, the Long Island Railroad and Bayshore community jointly installed a memorial plaque at the train station platform where Eve had last been seen alive. The bronze marker was mounted on the same platform too, where she had stepped off the 10:03 p.m. train on March 22, 1980. The plaque's inscription was simple but powerful, in memory of Eve Wilkowitz, 1959 to 1980, who dreamed of tomorrow but never saw another day. Her story reminds us that justice, though delayed, will not be denied. The dedication ceremony drew several hundred people, including many who had followed Eve's case for decades. Irene, now 60, stood beside the memorial as trains continued to arrive and depart, carrying passengers who would walk safely to their destinations in ways Eve never could. Eve took this train hundreds of times, Irene told the assembled crowd. She felt safe here, safe in this community, safe walking home at night. Herbert Rice stole that safety from her and from all of us. But we've taken it back. The memorial served multiple purposes. It honored Eve's memory, provided closure for the community, and reminded future generations about the importance of vigilance and justice. Most significantly, it transformed the train platform from the site of Eve's last known moments into a symbol of resilience and remembrance. Commuters who passed the memorial daily began to understand they were part of a larger story about community, safety, and the persistent pursuit of truth. Eve's final journey had become the beginning of a decades-long quest for justice that ultimately succeeded. On December 31, 2022, Irene made her final entry in the journal she had kept since 1980. The leather-bound book contained 42 years of grief, hope, frustration, and ultimately resolution. "Today I close this journal," she wrote in careful handwriting that had changed remarkably little since her teenage years. "Not because Eve's story is over, she will live in my heart until my last breath, but because the question that has haunted me for 42 years finally has an answer." She reflected on how the identification of Herbert Rice had changed her daily existence in subtle but profound ways. "I don't scan crowds anymore looking for the face of Eve's killer. I don't feel that electric jolt of fear when someone mentions a man from our old neighborhood. I don't wake up wondering if today will be the day we finally learn the truth. The truth is known." Irene had begun dating again for the first time in decades, finally able to trust and commit without the shadow of unresolved murder hanging over her relationships. She was planning her first vacation in years, no longer feeling guilty about experiencing joy while Eve's killer remained unidentified. "Herbert Rice took 42 years of my life along with Eve's," she wrote, "but he didn't take everything. I'm 60 years old and I have years ahead of me to live without fear, without the constant weight of unanswered questions." Her final words honored both her sister's memory and her own survival. "Eve, your killer has been named. Your case has been solved. Your sister is finally free to live again. Rest in peace, knowing that truth survived longer than secrets." The Suffolk County Police Department's 2022 annual report featured Eve Wilkowitz's case prominently in its section on cold case investigations. The case had become a model for how genetic genealogy could solve murders that had baffled investigators for decades. The Wilkowitz investigation demonstrates the importance of evidence preservation and family advocacy in cold case work. The report stated, "Without the meticulous evidence collection performed in 1980 and the persistent advocacy of the victim's family, this case could never have been solved." The report detailed how techniques developed during Eve's investigation had been applied to 12 other Suffolk County cold cases. 3 additional murders from the 1970s and 1980s had been solved using similar genetic genealogy methods. 2 sexual assault cases from the 1990s had been linked to suspects who were subsequently arrested and charged. Captain Rodriguez's cold case unit had become a regional training center for genetic genealogy investigations. Police departments from across New York State sent investigators to Suffolk County to learn techniques pioneered during Eve's case. "Every solved cold case represents multiple victories," Rodriguez explained in the report's introduction. "Justice for the victim, closure for the family, and safety for the community through the identification of dangerous individuals." The unit's success had attracted federal funding and academic partnerships. Researchers from nearby universities were studying the psychological and sociological impacts of cold case solutions on families and communities. Eve's case had evolved from a single unsolved murder into a catalyst for revolutionary changes in how law enforcement approached decades-old crimes. Her death had created ripple effects that would help deliver justice for countless other victims. 5 years after Herbert Rice was identified as Eve's killer, Bayshore had settled into a new normal. The case that had defined the community's relationship with crime and safety for 4 decades had been resolved, but its impact continued to shape local culture and law enforcement practices. The Bayshore Historical Society created a permanent exhibit about Eve's case, focusing not on the gruesome details of her murder, but on the community's response and the scientific breakthrough that eventually delivered justice. School groups toured the exhibit to learn about DNA science and the importance of never giving up on difficult problems. Irene, now 65, had become a volunteer advocate for other families dealing with unsolved murders. She spoke at conferences, met with police departments developing cold case programs, and counseled relatives who were walking the same difficult path she had traveled for over 4 decades. "The most important thing I learned," she told audiences, "is that hope and despair can coexist. You can grieve your loved one while still fighting for answers. You can accept that justice might take decades while never accepting that justice will never come." Herbert Rice's grave in St. Patrick's Cemetery remained unmarked except for his simple granite headstone. No flowers were ever placed there, no visitors came to pay respects. His son, Michael, had moved away from Florida, unable to reconcile his childhood memories with the reality of his father's crimes. The contrast between Eve's memorial garden, always filled with fresh flowers and visitors, and Rice's neglected gravesite seemed fitting. Even in death, the victim's memory shone brighter than her killer's legacy. As Bayshore moved forward into the mid-2020s, Eve Wilkowitz's story had become woven into the community's identity, not as a tale of horror and fear, but as a testament to persistence, scientific progress, and the power of family love to sustain hope across decades of uncertainty. Children who played in Eve's garden learned her story from their parents and grandparents. The train station memorial became a touchstone for commuters who understood they were part of a larger narrative about community safety and mutual responsibility. Detective work had evolved dramatically since 1980, but the core principles remained unchanged: careful evidence collection, persistent investigation, and refusal to abandon victims or their families. Eve's case embodied all of these principles, showing how justice could prevail even when delayed by decades. The final lesson of Eve's story was perhaps the most important. Evil might hide successfully for years, even decades, but truth has its own persistence. Science advances, databases grow, and secrets that seem safely buried have a way of surfacing when least expected. Herbert Rice had lived 30 years after murdering Eve, carrying his secret to what he thought was a permanent grave. But his DNA, preserved in evidence he never knew existed, eventually spoke louder than his silence. On quiet evenings in Bayshore, when trains arrived at Platform 2 and passengers walked safely home to their families, Eve Wilkowitz's legacy lived on. Not as a victim, but as a reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, will not be denied. Her killer had been named, her case had been solved, her community had healed, and her sister, finally free from 4 decades of fear and uncertainty, could live again. The truth, as it always does, had prevailed.